I wonder if I even have my arms fully around exactly what's going on. But so again, from my background as a person who's a biologist, fundamentally looking at whole system biology, meaning at least at this whole cell level, is where a lot of my research was done. I understand intimately the role of energy and resources, and you either remembered to plate your cells out with appropriate levels of medium and glucose, or you didn't. And if you didn't, they would all ball up and get very simple and very unhappy looking. And I understand where we are as a species in this story. And so that's a frame I bring to this, and I'm open to all the other ones too. But my frame says we're at a really critical moment in our species history. I think people are detecting that on many different levels, but of course, you can't even open up the newspaper or online news source without finding out there's something not quite right with microplastics and where'd the fish go and what's up with the insects and can we really suck this aquifer down at 6% a year when it takes 10,000 years to recharge, and on and on and on, right? And from that, COVID then becomes the backdrop, which says, look, we couldn't even discuss ivermectin without like losing the plot line. How are we going to manage disappearing ecosystem services that we haven't even properly mapped yet, let alone begun to
Oh,
appreciate?
this is such a beautiful point, right? If you are going to be bewildered by a campaign as transparent as the, I don't know, the great horse dewormer gunshot victim
Yes,
debacle, if you're going to
Armageddon.
be fooled by that, you're not going to get the question of pesticides and its implication, right? You're not going to be able to navigate the question of how does, a mRNA lipid nanoparticle vaccine compare to a live attenuated virus. You just don't have the tools, right? You're easily fooled. And it's one thing to know that and to say, hey, look, I'm out. It's another thing to think you do get it. And we've been, I don't know, we've been quite buffeted by many, many people who pretended to have good tools and just didn't. But I want to switch gears a little bit here, and we have been so far talking kind of generally about where we're going. You said you don't quite have your arms around where we are, and I would say actually, I think that this is sort of the primary entrance requirement to the adult discussion, right? If you're really paying attention to what's going on, you know that you don't know where we are, right? There are possibilities. You may have a sense that it's this and not that. You can say certain things aren't likely to be true. But I don't know anybody, right? The most informed people in the world who are not on the inside don't know what this is about, and therefore don't know what it is that will be protected and obscured in this phase where we go from the public health narrative collapsing on the public health authorities to whatever they're going to do in the great scramble to come. And I fear that because people have the sort of sense of relief that, I mean, I don't know what you've seen. You're out east. You're in Massachusetts. Is that right? So I'm out here in Oregon. We're living physically very different existences among people who aren't connected. What I'm watching is Omicron completely overwhelmed even the false impression that control was possible, and it caused everybody to kind of surrender, and they just stopped taking COVID seriously. And that was interesting, and they, frankly, with Omicron, it's probably the right approach for many reasons because A, you're not going to control it with masks, right? You're not going to control it with masks. Boosters make less than no sense given the evidence of the vaccinated being so very vulnerable to contracting and transmitting Omicron. But in any case, people just sort of, I think they breathed a sigh of relief and moved on. And the problem is we are dealing with a self-inflicted wound. COVID appears to be a self-inflicted wound of unprecedented scale, right? 2 years of turning the entire world upside down over a virus that appears to have been enhanced and then escaped. Now, that is an amazing error to have made, and the costs will never be fully understood. right? The costs are absolutely gigantic. So it stands to reason that our top priority ought to be figuring out exactly what happened and building the best protections we can to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because frankly, as bad and unprecedented as it was, it could have been worse. So then we are left with the question of, well, what should happen now? And increasingly, I am preoccupied with the way that those who did this are going to escape being properly revealed, and the reforms that are necessary will be avoided. Because, of course, this was, whatever its fundamental nature, this was the mother of all opportunities for certain people. Right? The amount of wealth that was generated on the back of COVID, the amount of power that was concentrated, the amount of progress that tyrants have made in getting us to surrender our rights and getting used to the idea that that's a normal thing to do, right? These were spectacular changes, and they are now going to do everything in their power to avoid us understanding what happened so that they can do it again. And we must stop that, but that involves recognizing where we are. This is not the end. It might be the end of COVID. It might be that another variant pops up and returns us to some place or takes us someplace new. Those are live possibilities. You can tell me if you see reasons to think they aren't. But at the level of what happens to society, which frankly, I think you'll agree is much more dangerous than what happens to us as a result of this particular virus, we are still in grave jeopardy, and the game is only just beginning.
Thank you. I love having this conversation. It was May of 2020 when I put out a first video where I was like, this thing kind of looks like it came from a lab, right? And I was using the genetic information on it, in particular the PRRA furin cleavage site. I was like, that's weird. And I couldn't find any other nearby viruses that had that particular sequence, so it had to have gotten it from somewhere. And so there wasn't a molecular or biological or evolutionary explanation for it that made sense. So you weigh the evidence, and I was like, pretty sure this came from a lab, right? So I was a conspiracy theorist for a full year in the press. And then somehow that story changed one day. All of a sudden it was okay to talk about it. And that was interesting watching the narrative control. But I agree with you completely that if we don't not only find out how it arose and how it got to escape, not only find the people who were responsible for that and find out if they broke any laws or rules, right? If we don't do that, they've just learned, oh, we can get away with this. And when people have no consequences and they learn they can get away with something, they'll do it again, particularly if they get to make trillions of dollars and, secure vast new rights and powers and things like that. So I think it's really troubling that my culture in the United States, that our press is, they sort of weekly sort of look at this lab leak thing, but they're not really on it. It's like they don't have an interest in finding out why or how that might have happened. And I think that's an error, a big error, because it'll just happen again. That's not a prediction in the sense that I'm trying to tell you something in the future that's uncertain. That's like saying, if I let go of a hammer, it's going to fall to the ground.
I don't think it's an error. And I don't want to describe it in overly deliberate terms, because I think a lot of this functions subconsciously, that people detect that there is something desired from them and they do it and it rewards them and they don't exactly know why they were invited to do it. But the whole idea that the horses are out of the barn, why are we so concerned with the origin? Yes, it's kind of interesting. It would be nice if we knew someday what happened, but what does it change? This is very wrong on two fronts. I mean, for one thing, if it did come from a lab, and it seems almost certain that it did, we have a right to know the protocols that generated it, which might well tell us something useful about how to address it. And the idea that anybody has the right to say, nah, you won't find anything interesting there is preposterous. But what I really think is happening is that a lot of people who weren't ahead and who didn't suffer the stigma of saying, hey, this looks like a lab leak. It's not making me happy to say it, but it looks like one. People who didn't do that and people who said terrible things about folks like us who did are signaling to power that effectively they're advertising a willingness to embrace amnesty for the lab leak. Right? I'm not going to go after this. And the point is, I see a negotiation unfolding in the world at the moment. And the negotiation involves people, the public is going to want an explanation of how the public health authorities got it so wrong. And so there's a scramble to fill that need. But the point is, the people who got this so wrong are connected to the most powerful forces in the world. And so they get some say in who they have to confess to and how much they have to confess. And what they want to do is confess enough that it is satisfying and not so much that anything changes. And I really think that this is what happens next, right? They are bargaining with the middle ground. Those who got it wrong are going to move in the direction of right. But the whole idea is to save the elite rent seekers who, at the very least, took merciless advantage of the situation from the reckoning that would be natural and from the reforms that would plug the leak. So, yeah, the lab leak is a good model because we won that battle for the most part early. And we can say what happened, right? There was a mad scramble amongst people who had gotten lab leak wrong to become the new voices of reason who acknowledged that there was a lab leak and were able to point to indications that they may have left that possibility open before. But anything was better than going to the people who said, actually, you have no idea how high the chances are and how much evidence there is, and the fact that there is exactly zero evidence pointing in the other direction. And, you ought to be thinking about this. So, yeah, I see a kind of de facto negotiation, and I wish there was some way to describe it so that people did not hear it as the allegation of a smoke-filled room in which people are actually talking, because that's not the kind of negotiation it is, right? It's an as-if negotiation.
There's, I agree with that. There's, so there was a chart in a book that showed, and this was by Ralph Baric, and it showed, this is pre-COVID, but it showed all the things that we humans had been doing with coronaviruses. And so the first time that we'd taken a chimera and taken a piece off of one and put it in and made it more infective in an animal model was 1998. And there might have been earlier stuff, but that's the first publication on this chart. And then there's like all these seminal things people are doing, including by 2002, Ralph Baric had figured out how to do the no-see-um inserts so that you could actually build an entire viral construct without anybody being able to detect that it had been through a lab. He got a patent on that. It was 2003 when SARS broke out. So prior to SARS, we'd never had a pandemic coronavirus. Prior to humans monkeying around trying to make them more infectious, we'd never had one. So my questioning about this whole thing goes back a long way now. And so you watch the MERS thing come out and you watch this thing come out, SARS-CoV-2. It's clearly been manipulated. And, I have a whole story about Omicron, too, which looks even more manipulated. It's pretty obvious. So I think we have to have that conversation, though, because I don't know that it's pretty clear that whether people meant well, they had a white hat sort of a reason. They thought that this was going to advance knowledge so that we could learn things that would be important. I think what's missing in that is the hubris has overshadowed this idea that even 30,000 tiny strings of letters, which we'll call the RNA code of this particular virus, is too complicated for us to understand or manage. Like, it just did wildly complex things inside the human body when it got in there. I don't know if you saw this, Brett, but there was a study that showed that not only is this 38, kilobits of information come forward and enter a cell and do all this stuff, but it has little proteins that it shuttles into the nucleus to turn certain genes on and off. It's just so ridiculously complex, but there are people who think we can control that and learn from that and fiddle with that. So in essence, what we're dealing with SARS-CoV-2 now is humans as a species, we're having to adjust to a virus that didn't go through the normal, call it normal pathways. So it got a big sudden jump in evolution, and that's not a normal condition. So we're gonna learn some things about this, and I don't think we're over yet in learning some things. There might be things we discover in 3, 4, 5 years, like real long haul COVID. We don't know. We don't know. And that's what bothers me, is that these people who did this, Brett, they still are operating with that sort of hubris and impunity that says, well, even if it escaped, we can do better next time. But I think we're at Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park,
Yeah, or The Fly.
It's like, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
So
right?
this is a battle that I'm going to avoid ranting, but this is a battle that has been going on forever, and that animated me when I was a graduate student, right? Because the lab that I was in was actually a lab of effectively refugees from the rest of the biology department. These are people who understood the power of selection. And so, the funny thing is I graduated having come from the entomology lab. I'm not an entomologist. I studied bats. And most of the people in that lab under Dick Alexander didn't study bugs. They studied dolphins and birds and every other thing, right? And the reason was that was the place where people who understood the power of selection had gathered, because it wasn't all that hospitable anywhere else in the department, right? The ecologists, by and large, didn't get it, right? The cellular molecular people didn't get it. And so the point is, look, you believe in the evolutionary story in the textbook, which is a feeble cartoon compared to the real thing, right? The idea that you think you know anything about the virus that you've created, when what you've really done is put something on the foothill of some mountain range you don't know anything about. And what you do know is that it's got a program for climbing, right? It's going to become something. It's not under your control. The question is, what niche did you just bring it to? And there's a perfectly good example of this. Hawaii is a tropical landmass, right? It's a tropical archipelago. You would expect high biological diversity because tropical habitats tend to have high biological diversity, but it doesn't because it's so remote, right? It's remote, and that means things don't get to Hawaii. And so what's there are things that were very good at crossing extremely long, inhospitable distances, right? So it's an interesting habitat, lots of unique things there, but it's not high diversity. You can take almost any mainland creature there that finds it climatically hospitable, and the thing will take off because you've solved the hard problem of getting to Hawaii by taking it there on an airplane. Mm-hmm. And now it's a better competitor than all the things that were adapted for getting to a place like Hawaii and persisting there. So the point is, we've introduced creatures. We've introduced, mongoose, for example. You can't get rid of them, right? What you've just done is solved an evolutionary problem that evolution couldn't solve, and then you've let evolution take it from there. And this is a recipe for disaster. The idea that you're going to create something in a lab and think that you're its master, come on. This is natural selection. It built you, right? This is the most powerful process for, upending plans that could conceivably exist. And you're just playing with fire. And what's more, you're not playing with fire in the way that people used to play with fire, where they would blow themselves up. You're talking about the whole world. Somebody made an error. In fact, in this case, people were wise enough to see it coming, and they tried to ban this research. And Anthony Fauci decided to override them, right? That error, Anthony Fauci overriding a gain-of-function research ban, very likely resulted in a particular viral particle escaping off a particular lab bench into a particular human being, and then COVID-19, right? That is the capacity of selection to take a tiny error, right? Literally a microscopic error, and turn it into a global catastrophe. That's the power of the process you're fucking with. And if you don't respect it, we're going to be facing this again and again, because our power is only growing with respect to starting these things, to setting them in motion. And, it's such a terrible, terrible failure of wisdom.
I completely agree. So, yeah, rant on.